So this video is about the Australian government withdrawing the funding for psychological therapies under the National Health Insurance Scheme here in Australia called Medicare. In part one, I'll tell you about that withdrawal of funding and mainstream psychology's response to it, and then tell you why psychotherapy is problematic. And in part two, I'll go on to explain why psychotherapy doesn't work. It's hard to say, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work for those who need it. So here in Australia, on December the 12th, 2022, we had a story that ran in our national press on how psychologists were appalled at the Australian government's decision to end the funding for extra psychotherapy sessions for people with mental health problems. Now, it's expensive seeing a psychologist. The Australian Psychological Society, the APS, that's the main body that promotes psychological practice to the Australian public and promotes the interests of psychologists. Well, the APS, at the moment, recommend that practitioners charge 280 Australian dollars for a 46 to 60-minute consultation. That's around 190 US dollars or 150 British pounds. By way of comparison, your average plumber here in Australia charges 40 Australian dollars an hour. So you're getting 4.5 plumbers for every one psychologist. That cost is putting psychologists out of reach of a lot of people. But there's Medicare. So Medicare is a universal healthcare insurance scheme in Australia, which is funded under general taxation. The government sets out a schedule of fees which it will reimburse healthcare providers for. At the moment, that's around $130 per session with a clinical psychologist. It's $85 for a non-clinical psychologist. By the way, I'm talking about Australian dollars throughout, not US dollars. Okay, because I'm in Australia. So the refund is less for non-clinical psychologists. I'll tell you more about that later. So if you see a clinical psychologist who charges $280, the APS recommended rate, you'll end up paying $150 for that session out of your own pocket. So it's better, but it's still not that affordable for many people. But some psychologists do this thing called bulk billing, which is where the healthcare provider doesn't charge the patient anything. It just claims the fee from that schedule of fees from the government. So for the patient, it's free of charge. But typically, there's a longer waiting list for those psychologists because there aren't that many of them. And they also might not offer you bulk billing if you're not on a low income. In 2017, 80% of all clinical hours worked by psychologists was in the private sector, and only 6% of private practices offer bulk billing. The only way you become eligible for psychological therapy under Medicare is if you get referred to a psychologist by your doctor. They decide if you're mentally unwell and would benefit from psychotherapy. If they do, they draw up a mental health plan for you that can include up to 10 sessions a year with a registered psychologist. And they can suggest more sessions than that, but only 10 sessions a year can be funded under Medicare. Well, that was until COVID came along, because then the government decided 10 sessions wasn't enough because we were all so stressed out. So they increased it to 20 sessions a year. And this was brought in at the start of October 2020, which is about 6 months after lockdowns began in Australia. But the funding, that extra funding for those extra 10 sessions was only going to happen up until the end of 2022. So it's now coming to an end. It's now being stopped. And we had organizations like the APS getting very upset about it, making claims such as, we know that therapy is effective, but people need more than 10 sessions. And they cite various research findings to support their claims. What they don't also cite is the abundance of research that doesn't support their claims. And there's a lot of that research that's out there. So some research shows psychotherapy is effective, but other research shows that it isn't. And psychologists remain divided over this. Indeed, psychotherapy is one of the most controversial healthcare procedures ever invented, and the debate around it is highly polarized. But as can happen when things become polarized, one side can get the backing from authority structures. In this instance, that side, the side that says psychotherapy is effective, is backed by the APS, Australian Psychological Society. The reason the APS has taken that side could be read as out of self-interest. Clinical psychologists, who are seen as, by some at least, as those who are most qualified, and I will get back to that, as those who are most qualified to do psychotherapy, those clinical psychologists, they make up the largest number of members in the APS, and most of them support that notion that psychotherapy is effective. Of course they would. When one gets one side backed by authority structures, it becomes the orthodox position, and it turns hegemonic at the point when people don't realize that there's actually another side to the argument. But that other side of the argument does exist. It's not supported by the most powerful institutions in psychology. Rather, it is supported by groups who don't hold authority, such as the psychiatric survivor groups. It's also supported by some psychologists, particularly critical psychologists, people like me. But people like me and critical psychologists and patient groups like psychiatric survivors movement, we don't really have a voice in the APS. I don't, because I'm not a member. But generally, critical psychology does not have representation in the APS. Out of the 9 colleges and 41 interest groups in the APS, not one represents critical psychology. And that means that the side that argues psychotherapy is ineffective becomes seen, if it's seen at all, as the non-orthodox position or the controversial view. So a book like Against Therapy by Jeffrey Masson, which argues that psychotherapy is a form of socially sanctioned abuse, is mostly described as controversial. And the book House of Cards by Robin Dawes, which convincingly argues that the effectiveness of psychotherapy is built on a series of myths, that book is described also as controversial. Now, one particularly compelling line of argument from that so-called controversial side of the argument, the argument that psychotherapy is not effective, it states that psychotherapy is not based on science. It's not developed from empirical research. Rather, it's faith-based. It's a faith-based approach that's instilled by systems of authority. The benefit of psychotherapy hinges on the quality of the human relationships between the clinician and the patient. In effect, it's nothing more than a placebo. If it works because a patient believes it will work. And people believe it will work if it fits their worldview, and if they've been persuaded that it works by people in positions of authority, whom they respect. But that all gets undone. The effect of psychotherapy as a placebo, all of that gets undone, and psychotherapy gets rendered as ineffective if that authority, if people are persuaded that it works, happens through systems of power and control. That's because psychological help is more effective when there's symmetry in the power relationship between the therapist and the client, i.e. that you are equals. So if you go to see a psychologist, they're a doctor, they have a PhD. Maybe you're not a doctor, but maybe you're a professional, like they are. Maybe you have an equivalent standing in your area of work. Maybe you're a senior manager at your place of work. Maybe you're on an equivalent salary. You're as wealthy as they are, or you are almost as wealthy as your therapist. At least you have that sense that you might be. And you sense that through the clues you can read, such as the social class of your therapist. When you have an imbalance in power, you have the increased likelihood of things going wrong in a psychotherapeutic relationship. One party can end up feeling manipulated or suspicious of the motives of the other. And there's also the risk of one party becoming dependent on the other. One party becomes more active, directing things, the other more passive, following things. And that's when things shift from counseling to compliance. And that's not good, because the client might tell you, if you're the clinical psychologist, your client might tell you that they're feeling better, but they tell you that out of compliance because they feel they're expected to feel better, but they don't actually feel better. And often that happens when you have that power imbalance. That's also why help works best when it's reciprocal. The helper is also helped. I've got another video on that. If you're watching this video on YouTube, you can find the link. There's the video. I'll stick the little image up there, the thumbnail, and the link to it, I'll put it in the description box below. Now, all of this is important because of what we know about which groups have the worst mental health and the groups that need the most help. You know, is it the people who are on an equal standing, have equal status as psychologists? You know, are these professional people who need the most help? If it is, then great, because they'll go into a therapeutic environment where there's an symmetry and power relationship between them and their therapist. Maybe it isn't those people who need the most help. The people who are in most need of psychological help are people who live in poverty. And they're not poor because they have a mental health problem. They have a mental health problem because they're poor. Poverty causes poor mental health. This is not rocket science. We have research that shows this if you need to see it. In 2018, a study published in Frontiers in Psychiatry, here's the full citation, also in the description box below, if you're watching on YouTube. That study reported that 1 in 4 people in the poorest sector of Australia have high or very high levels of psychological distress. That's 1 in 4. That's compared to 1 in 20 of people who live in the richest sector. If someone has very high levels of distress, this is strongly predictive of them being diagnosed with a serious mental illness. And poor people have much higher levels of stress than people who live in, say, well-to-do communities, because people who live in poverty are much more frequently exposed to violence, to crime, to inadequate housing or homelessness, to psychologically damaging periods of employment or unemployment. Life's tough when you don't have money, and society doesn't value you if you don't have money. Society values rich people. It doesn't value poor people. Now, here's the thing. When it comes to poor people getting access to psychotherapy under Medicare, generally they don't get the access. Typically, when poor people go to the doctors because they're experiencing high levels of distress, they do get diagnosed with a mental health condition like depression or an anxiety disorder, but typically their doctor doesn't refer them to a psychologist for psychotherapy. Instead, they get prescribed medication. And in part 2, I'll tell you why that happens, or why I think that happens. So, till then, ta-da.